The conference room hummed with quiet conversations as I glanced at my phone, its screen lighting up with an incoming call from Ethan. Expecting the usual small talk, maybe a casual, "How's the trip?" or "When will you be home?" I stepped into the hallway, pressing the phone to my ear. But the moment I heard his voice, I knew something was off. "I'm divorcing you," Ethan said, his tone cold, almost smug. "Oh, and I've already sold the apartment, so you'll need to figure out where you're going to live." For a second, I couldn't breathe. The audacity, the complete lack of remorse. It was almost laughable. My grip tightened around the phone as his words settled in. "You sold the apartment?" I asked, keeping my voice steady.
"Yeah."
He let out a dry chuckle. "Emily and I need the money to start our life together. She deserves better than that tiny place anyway." Emily. The name stung. I had suspected for months that there was someone else. Ethan's late nights, the sudden business trips, the growing distance between us. But to hear him say her name so casually, as if I were the outsider in my own life, sent a fire through my chest. "Sounds good," I replied evenly, refusing to give him the reaction he wanted. "My name is Olivia, and up until that phone call, I thought I was married to a man I could trust. Ethan and I had been together for 6 years. Our apartment, a cozy 2-bedroom in the heart of the city, had been our dream, a symbol of everything we had built together. Or so I had believed. Looking back, the signs had always been there. His dismissiveness whenever I brought up finances, the way he brushed off my concerns with a charming smile and a quick kiss. I had assumed his confidence came from knowing what he was doing. Now, I realized it came from knowing he could manipulate me. But there was one thing Ethan didn't know. The apartment he thought he had sold? It was legally mine. Months ago, when we refinanced, I had the deed transferred to my name alone. Ethan had signed off without a second glance, too preoccupied with lowering our interest rate to care about the details. His carelessness was about to be his downfall. By the time I returned to my hotel room that evening, the shock had turned into something else. Resolve. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to beg. If Ethan wanted a fight, he was going to get one. And this time, I was going to win. The first call I made was to Julia, my lawyer and longtime friend. "He sold the apartment?" she repeated, incredulous. "Does he even realize he can't do that without your consent?" "Apparently not." A hint of amusement crept into my voice. "He thinks he's already spent the money on his new life with Emily." Julia laughed dryly. "Well, he's in for a rude awakening. The sale is invalid. You have sole ownership. If he took money from the buyer, he's on the hook for fraud." The words sent a jolt of satisfaction through me. "What do we need to do?" "First, we notify the buyer. Then we send Ethan a formal letter outlining the consequences of his actions. If he tries anything else, we take him to court." As I hung up, a strange sense of calm settled over me. Ethan thought he had outsmarted me, that he had left me scrambling. But in reality, he had just set himself up for humiliation. The flight home gave me hours to think. Ethan's arrogance was astounding. He hadn't even tried to hide his betrayal, as if I was just another obstacle in his way. But instead of dwelling on anger, I focused on what I would do next. The moment I landed, I called Julia. "I'm back. What's the next step?" "We've already contacted the buyer," she said, her tone brisk and efficient. "They were furious. They're willing to cooperate." "And Ethan?" "I sent him the formal letter this morning," she said. "I imagine he's going to be furious."
"Good.
Let him stew." That evening, Ethan stormed into the apartment, his face red with anger. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, waving the letter in his hand. "You're telling me I can't sell the apartment? It's half mine." "No, Ethan," I said, crossing my arms. "It's not. The deed has been in my name for months." He froze, his face a mixture of confusion and rage. "What are you talking about?" I grabbed the deed from the file I had pulled earlier, holding it up. "After we refinanced, I had the deed transferred to my name. You signed off on it. Or did you just skim the paperwork like always?" For a moment, he said nothing. Then his expression twisted into a sneer. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" I stared at him, unblinking. The sale is already void, Ethan. The buyer knows it, and they're ready to take legal action. Oh, and if you spent any of that deposit, you're in even bigger trouble. His confidence wavered for the first time. You don't know what you're talking about, he muttered. Oh, I do. I took a step closer. You spent years treating me like I was too naive to notice what you were doing. But guess what? I've been paying attention. His frustration mounted. This is ridiculous. You can't just kick me out. I raised an eyebrow. Actually, I can. Over the next few days, his anger turned into desperation. He left frantic voicemails, some begging, some threatening. Meanwhile, Julia ensured every legal loose end was tied up. One night, he had the audacity to bring Emily to the apartment. So this is where we're staying? She asked smugly. I smiled. No. This is where Ethan was staying. You, Emily, won't be staying here at all. Her smile faltered. Ethan looked like he was about to explode. You can't do this, he shouted. This isn't your home, Ethan, I said. And it never will be again. Emily's expression turned icy as she turned on him. You told me this was your apartment, that you sold it. It's complicated, he stammered. It's not, I said. He committed fraud. And now you get to deal with that. Emily stepped away from him. You're unbelievable. Without another word, she stormed out. Ethan turned to me, desperation in his eyes. Olivia, please. I handed him a folder. This is the divorce paperwork. Sign it. He stared at it, pale. You really hate me that much? I let out a bitter laugh. No, Ethan. I don't hate you. I feel sorry for you. And with that, I closed the door behind him. For the first time in years, I finally felt free. I sat alone in my hotel room, staring at the city lights outside the window. Ethan's voice still echoed in my head, his smug declaration replaying like a cruel joke. I'm divorcing you. I sold the apartment. You'll need to figure out where to live. The betrayal stung, but what cut deeper was the realization that I had seen this coming. I just hadn't wanted to admit it. Ethan had always been dismissive when I asked about our finances, brushing me off with charming reassurances. Whenever I'd questioned his spending or brought up our future plans, he laughed, called me paranoid, and changed the subject. Over time, I had convinced myself that his confidence meant security, that he knew what he was doing. Now, I knew better. I thought back to the moment earlier this year when I had refinanced the apartment. At the time, Ethan had been too busy focusing on the lower interest rate to bother reading the fine print. He hadn't even asked why the deed was being transferred solely to my name. He had just signed. Careless. Overconfident. The very qualities that had allowed him to manipulate me were about to be his downfall. I refused to let him turn me into a victim. Reaching for my phone, I dialed Julia's number. She picked up on the second ring. Hey, Liv. How's the trip? I let out a slow breath. Ethan just called. He says he's divorcing me. And he claims he sold the apartment. There was silence for a beat. Then, he what? I repeated it, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Julia's tone sharpened. He does realize he can't sell something that isn't his, right? Apparently not. She let out a short, incredulous laugh. Well, he's in for a nasty surprise. The sale is void, Liv. He has no legal ground here. If he's already taken money from the buyer, he could be looking at fraud charges. A slow, cold satisfaction settled over me. What do we do next? First, we notify the buyer and let them know the sale isn't legal. Then, we send Ethan a formal letter outlining the consequences of his actions. She paused. If he's dumb enough to push back, we take him to court. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Good, I said. Let's make sure he knows exactly what he's dealing with. Julia's voice held a hint of amusement. Oh, he's going to regret every decision he's made this year. As I hung up, a sense of clarity settled over me. Ethan had thought he was leaving me powerless, that I would crumble, beg, or lash out in desperation. But he had underestimated me. This wasn't just about a marriage ending. It was about taking back everything he had tried to strip away from me, my home, my stability, my dignity. and I was going to make sure he paid for every last bit of it. The rest of my business trip passed in a blur. I attended meetings, nodded at the right moments, and delivered presentations as if nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, my mind was razor-sharp, focused on the battle ahead. I refused to let Ethan take anything more from me, not my home, not my dignity, and certainly not my peace. By the time my plane landed, I was more than ready. The first call I made was to Julia. "I'm back," I said, wheeling my suitcase toward the terminal exit. "What's the latest?" Her tone was crisp, efficient. "We've notified the buyer." They were furious, rightfully so. They're willing to cooperate, which strengthens our case. She hesitated. Ethan, on the other hand, well, let's just say he's in for a wake-up call. A cold smile touched my lips. Perfect. When I arrived at the apartment, the silence was unsettling. Ethan's things were still there, his jacket draped over a chair, his shoes kicked off carelessly by the door, his coffee mug still sitting on the counter like he'd just been there that morning. Even in his absence, his presence lingered. I set my suitcase down, inhaling deeply. This was my home, and I would not let him take that from me. Hours later, Ethan came storming through the door, his face red with fury, a crumpled letter in his hand. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, shaking the paper in my direction. "You're telling me I can't sell the apartment? It's half mine." I folded my arms, unbothered.
"No, Ethan."
"It's not." His eyes narrowed. "You're lying." I turned, walking to the side table where I had placed a folder earlier that evening. Pulling out the deed, I held it up. "You remember when we refinanced?" I asked, voice calm, measured. "You signed the paperwork without even reading it. The deed was transferred to my name months ago." Ethan froze. His eyes flickered from the document to me, then back again. "No," he muttered. His arrogance cracked, giving way to something else.
Panic.
"Check for yourself," I said, placing the deed on the counter. He hesitated before snatching it up, scanning the pages with frantic eyes. His breathing grew heavier with each line he read, his hands tightening around the edges of the paper. This isn't possible," he stammered. "You tricked me." I let out a quiet laugh.
"No, Ethan."
"You just never paid attention." The weight of his mistake hit him in real time. His shoulders slumped, his confidence crumbling as reality set in. He had thought he could manipulate me, blindside me, and walk away untouched. Instead, he had walked himself straight into a disaster. And now he had to deal with the consequences. Ethan's grip on the deed tightened as he scanned the pages again, as if willing the words to change. His jaw clenched, his confidence slipping away. But instead of admitting defeat, he shifted tactics. "You're really going to do this?" His voice dropped into something softer, something calculated. "You're just going to throw away 6 years like they meant nothing?" I didn't flinch. "You threw them away the second you betrayed me." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head.
"Wow.
"So this is who you really are."
Cold.
"Heartless. I gave you everything, Olivia, and this is how you repay me?" I arched an eyebrow. "You gave me everything?" I gestured around the apartment. "The home I secured? The finances I managed? The life I held together while you lied and schemed behind my back?" Ethan opened his mouth, but I didn't let him speak. "You don't have a leg to stand on, Ethan," I continued. "The buyer has already rescinded the deal, and if you've spent any of that money, you've got bigger problems than me." His eyes darkened, his bravado cracking further. "That's not." "Oh, and before you try to play the victim," I cut in, my voice even unwavering, "let me remind you that you called me. You thought you could throw me out of my own home and walk away scot-free. But guess what? You failed." The silence between us stretched, heavy and charged. Then, like a switch flipping, Ethan's demeanor changed. His lips curled into a smirk. "You know, Liv, you're not as smart as you think you are. Here we go. Don't forget," he continued, stepping closer, lowering his voice. "I know you. I know how you think. I know what makes you tick. And I know you don't have it in you to see this through." I tilted my head, unimpressed. "Is that so?" He nodded, confidence creeping back into his expression. You've always been too emotional, too sentimental. Eventually you'll crack. You'll second-guess yourself. And when you do, I'll be waiting. A slow smile spread across my lips. You're wrong, Ethan, I said simply. And for the first time, I saw it, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. I leaned in slightly. You don't know me as well as you think you do. His smirk faltered, just a little. A buzzing sound interrupted the standoff, my phone vibrating on the counter. I glanced at the screen. Julia. I answered on speaker. You're on. Just wanted to update you. Julia's voice came through, brisk and professional. Everything is in motion. Divorce paperwork is being finalized and Tyler, oh, sorry Ethan, has no legal grounds to fight anything. I watched as Ethan's face paled at the mention of his real predicament. Julia continued, and if he's spent any of the deposit, well, let's just say the fraud charges will be hard to dodge. I crossed my arms. Anything else? Just one more thing, Julia added, her voice tinged with amusement. He should probably start looking for somewhere else to live. Immediately. Ethan's fingers twitched around the deed. His breathing was shallow, his mind clearly racing. I hung up. For a long moment he just stood there. Then he did what he always did, he tried another angle. You can't do this to me, he said, this time his voice edged with desperation. Liv, please. We can work something out. I shook my head. No, we can't. His desperation sharpened. You're ruining my life. I laughed, a small, bitter sound. You did that all on your own. For the next few days, Ethan spiraled. My phone flooded with voicemails, each one an emotional roller coaster. One moment, he was apologizing, swearing he'd made a mistake, telling me he still loved me. The next, he was cursing me, threatening that I'd regret this, that I was destroying everything for no reason. I didn't respond. I had no reason to. Instead, I focused on me, on reclaiming my life. And for the first time in years, I felt in control. The knock on the door came just as I was reviewing some paperwork at the dining table. I knew who it was before I even opened it. Ethan. But what I wasn't expecting was her. Nicole stood beside him, arm looped through his, a smug smile plastered across her face, as if she already owned the place. So this is where we'll be staying, she mused, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Her eyes roamed over the apartment, assessing it like she had just acquired a new prize. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. No, I said coolly. This is where Ethan was staying. You won't be staying here at all. Nicole's smile faltered. She looked between me and Ethan, confusion flashing across her perfectly made-up face. Wait, what? Ethan's jaw tightened. Liv, don't start this. Oh, I'm not starting anything, I interrupted. I'm just stating facts. I turned to Nicole, meeting her gaze head-on. Ethan doesn't own this apartment. I do. It's been in my name for months. Her brows furrowed, and she let out a short, disbelieving laugh. That's not true. Ethan sold this place. I smirked. Oh, did he? That's interesting because the sale was void before it even started. Ethan never had the right to sell it in the first place. Nicole's eyes darted to Ethan, looking for reassurance. Tell me she's lying. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. It's complicated. Nicole's grip on his arm loosened. Complicated? Her tone sharpened. You told me this was your apartment. That you sold it. That we'd have the money to start fresh. I watched as the realization settled in. He had lied to her too.
Nicole took a step back.
Oh my God, she whispered, her face contorting in disbelief. You don't have the money, do you? Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his frustration mounting. Nicole, listen.
No, she snapped.
You said this was handled. That we had nothing to worry about. Were you seriously planning to just move in here without telling me you had no claim to this place? Ethan gritted his teeth. We would have figured something out. Nicole let out a bitter laugh. Unbelievable. I folded my arms, enjoying the show. Oh, trust me, it gets better. Nicole turned to me, eyes blazing. You knew, didn't you? that this would happen? I shrugged. I knew Ethan would try to pull something stupid. I just didn't think he'd be dumb enough to drag you into it, too. Her face burned with embarrassment, her fury now fully directed at Ethan. You lied to me. Nicole, calm down. Calm down. She threw her hands up. You ruined me. I left everything because you said we had a future together. But you don't even have a place to live. Ethan reached for her, but she jerked away. I cannot believe I fell for this. And then, without another word, she grabbed her purse and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Ethan stood frozen, staring at the door as if willing her to come back. I exhaled slowly, relishing the silence. Well, that was brutal. He turned to me, eyes dark with rage, but there was something else there too. Humiliation. You set me up, he accused. I laughed.
No, Ethan.
You set yourself up. For the first time, he had nothing left to say. No smug remarks. No last-ditch attempts to manipulate me. Just a man standing in the ruins of his own arrogance. And I had never felt more victorious. Ethan stood there, shoulders slumped, staring at the floor like a man who had finally realized he had nothing left to fight for. Nicole was gone.
His scheme had collapsed.
And now he was standing in an apartment that no longer belonged to him, if it ever truly had. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I walked to the counter, picked up a folder, and placed it on the table between us. The divorce papers, I said, my voice steady. It's over, Ethan. There's nothing left to discuss. His eyes flickered to the folder, then back to me. Liv, his voice was softer now, almost pleading. We don't have to do this like this. I raised an eyebrow. Oh, and how exactly do you think we should do this? He exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. I screwed up. I know that. But we've been together for years. Doesn't that mean something? I let out a short, humorless laugh. You mean the same years you were lying to me? Manipulating me? Planning a life with someone else behind my back? Ethan opened his mouth, but I didn't give him the chance. No, I continued. It doesn't mean anything. Not anymore. His hands curled into fists at his sides. You really hate me that much? I met his gaze, unflinching. I don't hate you, Ethan. I pity you. He flinched. Out of all the things I could have said, that one seemed to cut the deepest. With nothing left to say, Ethan finally accepted his defeat. Wordlessly, he grabbed the folder, flipped it open, and scrawled his signature on the divorce papers. The moment his pen left the page, I felt it, the weight lifting. His final tie to me had been severed. Ethan closed the folder and let out a slow, defeated breath. I'll pack my things. I nodded, stepping aside as he moved through the apartment, gathering the remnants of his life. His clothes, his shoes, the framed photos he hadn't even bothered to take down before. He moved methodically, but I could see it. The way his hands trembled, the way his shoulders hunched as if the full weight of his mistakes had finally settled on him. He had walked in here thinking he held all the power. Now he was leaving with nothing. Minutes passed in silence. When he was finally finished, he stood at the door, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He looked back at me one last time. This isn't how I thought things would end, he admitted. I tilted my head. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you tried to destroy me. His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He just nodded stiffly, turned, and walked out. I didn't watch him go. Instead, I closed the door behind him, locked it, and reached into my pocket, pulling out a fresh set of keys. Within minutes, I had changed the locks, sealing him out of my life for good. The apartment was finally mine again. Not just legally, not just physically, but emotionally. For the first time in years, I stood in the middle of my home and felt something I hadn't in a long time.
Peace.
The silence wasn't lonely. It wasn't empty. It was freeing. And as I curled up on the couch that night, a glass of wine in hand and a new chapter ahead of me, I let myself smile. Because for the first time in a long time, my life was mine again. The apartment felt different. Lighter. With Ethan gone, it was finally mine again. The first thing I did was start reclaiming the space, piece by piece, room by room. I rearranged the furniture, swapped out the decorations, and removed every trace of him. The oversized gaming chair he'd insisted on keeping?
Gone.
The framed jerseys that cluttered the walls? Packed away. The gaudy coffee table he had loved? Replaced with something I actually liked. It wasn't just about redecorating. It was about erasing his presence, his influence. This was my home now, and I wanted it to feel like it. Lauren and Julia came over that weekend, armed with takeout and a bottle of champagne. To fresh starts, Lauren said, raising her glass. To never letting a man walk all over you again, Julia added with a smirk. I clinked my glass against theirs, feeling something I hadn't in a long time. Happiness. For the first time in years, I could breathe without the weight of Ethan's arrogance, his manipulations, his constant dismissal of me. He had spent years making me feel small, like I wasn't paying attention. But in the end, it was his carelessness that cost him everything. And now I was moving on. He tried to contact me, of course. A few weak attempts, texts that ranged from half-hearted apologies to pitiful attempts at nostalgia. I miss you, Liv. We had good times, didn't we? Can't we at least talk? I never replied. The divorce moved forward without a hitch. Ethan didn't have the energy to fight me anymore. He had no leverage, no money, and no power. And I had everything. One evening, as I was sorting through old boxes, I came across a photo of us. One from years ago, when we had still been happy, or at least when I had believed we were. I stared at it for a moment, waiting for the sadness to come. But it never did. Instead, I felt relief. This was closure. I tucked the photo into an envelope and slid it into the back of a drawer. I wasn't keeping it because I missed him. I was keeping it as a reminder of everything I had survived. A few weeks later, I stood on my balcony, a glass of wine in hand, looking out over the city. I had fought for this home, but I knew I wouldn't stay here forever. Someday, I'd move into a new place, one that wasn't tied to Ethan, one that I chose for me. But for now, this was enough. I raised my glass to the night sky, to the city below, to the woman I had become. To freedom, I whispered. And for the first time in years, I truly felt it.